So today I'm here speaking with two great people. We've worked together for a few years now, Victor Friedberg and Sara Eckhouse from FoodShot Global, which is a multi-stakeholder investment platform for moonshots in our food system. But I will let them probably describe that better than I have done. But thank you both so much for being with me here today.
Pleasure as always.
How are you both, and what did you have for breakfast?
Well, Louisa, I was having pine cones for breakfast. No, I'm only kidding because, we were talking about this before. You have a great protein cupboard behind you, but there's a pine cone on it, and we were trying to figure out why the pine cone was there. But that for another time.
Sara, what did you have for breakfast? And some people I've been talking to, their breakfast has changed since the lockdown period. There's certain items they're not able to get hold of that they normally are.
My breakfast, luckily, I've not had to change too much, but I had some berries and Icelandic yogurt. Oh,
very nice. I had a yogurt shortage where I am. I've now moved to Connecticut, and we did have a yogurt shortage. So I wasn't able to have my usual breakfast for a few weeks, but luckily.
Well, Louisa, I would be amiss here if I didn't put a plug in for lava. So we'd be happy to send you, lava to, Connecticut to make sure that you have your daily lava supply.
I have had some lava and it is delicious. Actually, I've tried
Excellent.
it. I'd love to have some more. That's a plant-based yogurt for those of you that don't know it. So just starting with this big question that I like to ask all my guests, slightly daunting, but I think it kicks off the conversation in a nice way. If you are to think about the food system in 2050, let's say the future food system, what do you think it will look like, and how will it differ from today? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll take the first, a stab at that. Sara is going to have a much younger profile and sort of vision, of that, given, I'm slightly older. So I'm going to look at it as rapidly approaching for me. I think the main change that ripples through every aspect of the food system, from agriculture to ingredients to what we eat, when we eat, how we eat, is that it's going to be more and more organized around nutrition and not around yield. And so, you're going to imagine a food system in which instead of bushels per acre, you're going to start thinking about nutrition per acre, because people are becoming, and certainly will be, more literate about nutrition and the role of food in their health and wellness. There's going to be more pressure on farming and food logistics to meet the challenges around climate change and resource availability. And obviously this fits into a lot of the work that we're doing at FoodShot Global, but I think that's the main change. It's not a single thing. It's that nutrition is going to become the centerpiece, and that's going to be more scientifically efficacious, and it's going to be more quantified, and it's going to be more precise. So that's my take, and I'll throw to Sara as well.
The nutrition is like the new yield.
Nutrition is the new yield. So you will see nutrition per acre, and bushels per acre will go away.
Interesting. Sara, what about you?
So I'm gonna, I think, go with kind of some things that I hope for in a future food system. And I think one that we're kind of seeing right now that's in process is kind of this biological revolution. So we're moving away from a movement away from chemicals and into understanding the biology of plants, of soil, of animals, and being able of the microbiome, and being able to kind of capitalize on that understanding and scientific advancement to reduce the need for chemical inputs and really be able to maximize efficiency, nutrient cycling, bioavailability of nutrients in a way that supports a better environmental outcomes and better health outcomes. And the second that I hope for is that we kind of revalue the role of food in health, so that as we understand and learn more about nutrition as a driver of health outcomes, which I think we can certainly see when it comes to COVID-19 and who is most vulnerable to the worst outcomes from getting COVID-19, and the impacts overall, that we really prioritize food in our nutrition systems, so medically, and that we kind of place the value on it that it deserves.
That's really interesting that you bring that up about impacts on nutrition on the complications of COVID-19. We just had an article out yesterday from Rob, our founding partner, about one of our portfolio companies, Brightseed, and they told me recently, which I could not believe, that only 12% of Americans are deemed metabolically healthy. So there's 82% who are, more at risk of potential, 88%, sorry, even more at risk of, COVID-19 having severe effects because they're eating the wrong foods.
Yeah.
That was a crazy statistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, our view, and I think many share it within the food system transformation community, is that the system has been, I don't want to say it's been broken, because it's been designed to do what it is doing for the last 100 years. But I think what COVID did was to expose more quickly and concisely the fault lines in that system, and the stresses that system was creating on human health, and the vulnerabilities that occurred because of it, and a lot of complex factors in it. Certainly, food, nutrition, and diet were underlying, the existing conditions. Part of who didn't get it. It wasn't that they got infected in greater numbers. It's just that they were more likely to be hospitalized, and certainly to have, higher rates, for mortality. So, this isn't a new phenomenon. This has been building for decades, and I think our view is it's a once in a generation opportunity, to rethink that food system in order to better prepare for the future. And I think there are four things, there are probably more, that we can identify as changes that need to happen in light of COVID. Clearly, and I think this is what the Brightseed conversation was around, chronic disease, diabetes, obesity, all of those rising levels, created a more vulnerable, population. That, is clear. To Sarah's sort of setup for what she was thinking about in terms of the 2050 view, that really is something that's been talked about, more and more within the investor community, is the food as medicine, sort of frame. And that's going to take on more and more momentum, as food becomes a opportunity to be intervene proactively, as well as therapeutically. Land management innovation. We've been encroaching on natural habitats decade after decade, some of that driven by expanded needs for food acreage, and how we handle that land management, what land reforms we put into place are going to be important. And then the fourth, which also ties into some of the things we'll be talking about in regards to FoodShot Global's work coming up, is around meat production, large scale industrial livestock production. While that's primarily been focused on bacterial issues, the rise of superbugs, all of those things, I know AgFunder has talked about throughout the years. Those are bacterial infections that have been on the rise, and larger chronic disease in regards to battling that. But there's no reason why that wouldn't start giving rise to more viral issues going forward. So I think it's a wake-up call for how we think about protein production overall, specifically meat production, and how we treat animals in the service of food. So just a couple thoughts on COVID.
Yes, well, and before we get on to talking more about your latest FoodShot, thinking about COVID's impact on food tech and ag tech more broadly, and your former colleagues at S2G recently put out a great report digging into some of this, thinking about some of the new trends, well, not necessarily new trends, but accelerated trends, for instance, online grocery shopping. There's a lot more of that obviously happening now. Trends towards thinking more about health, and people drinking a lot more orange juice, and people taking more vitamins and things. How many of those specific kind of ag tech, food tech trends do you think are here to stay? And what kind of reversion do you think there might be back to what people used to do? You could start by thinking about that grocery piece.
Yeah, so any of us on the front lines, now, either as investors or company operators, are living that question every day, and it has been probably the key question for the last 4 weeks. I can talk briefly about my view of what happened in the food industry from a grocery and retail perspective, a distribution perspective, a consumer driver perspective, but looking at it from just from from an operation standpoint, up to March 31st, which was not that long ago. Everything on the food system, day-to-day workings of the machine looked the same. There was the start of some signals of some, changes as people were becoming, sort of more, sort of home oriented, and, started to think about this lasting longer than the initial reports were coming up. But what happened very quickly was, the panic buying phenomenon, and everybody loading up on, pantry items, on comfort food, things that they were familiar with and that had, even legacy aspects to it. Probably if you were a big food company 3 months ago, you really didn't know exactly your place in what the next generation of food companies and food system was going to be. But then there was an amazing shift back, to, sort of more legacy thinking in regards to, baking and, meat consumption and,
Staples.
all those staples that everybody was very familiar with, very comfortable with. And so there was a rediscovery, I think, of, those foods. But at the same time, you saw incredible spikes, for Beyond Meat and sort of Oatly and, these sort of, plant-based alternatives, as well. You did see a lot of comfort food and, pantry items. But I think about 3 weeks ago, you could start feeling a shift coming back where people felt, okay, we've got a safety net established, in our pantries, and we have a better feel for how distribution is working with the retailers are going to do. I'm going to start, buying more of the things that I was familiar with and were really core to my food identity, prior to COVID. And a lot of the, the brands, I've invested in, and brands that, we all love, that may have been, somewhat, put on the back shelf. What was really interesting was that what it exposed was that there just isn't enough, there isn't enough capacity in the distribution system to handle a change like that. And so, you had 40% of the food market, that was in food service, overnight shifting to retail. And the entire distribution system was not prepared for being able to take on, that much capacity that quickly. And so getting products onto trucks, if you were a brand, that was doing, let's say, a company like, Lava, if you were a brand like that looking to get on shelf during that, change in distribution priority, you had to fight for your place on that truck. So there were shifts from the consumer that were absolute, that were real, that the retailers were responding to. Distribution systems followed the retailer and consumer lead on that, but they didn't have enough trucks in the system to manage that shift. So there was a lot of chaos and a lot of interruption for 2 to 3 weeks there, as more trucks were brought into the capacity, more more systems were set up for doing procurement and forecasting in ways that were not being done before. I think we're now at the tail end of that. It's starting to normalize to the degree anything can be normal these days. But in terms of consumer buying habits, it's shifting, back. Whether baking, which was a big winner for sort of this COVID period, flour, I saw statistics said, King Arthur was up 2,000%, during this period. When it shifts back and more normalizes, well, those, staple products and the behavior of loving to bake again and spending time in the kitchen, to do that kind of, time intensive but incredibly enjoyable work if you're have the gene for it. Will that stick afterwards? We'll have to see. But I think health and wellness and more focus on putting good things inside of you, I think that's here to stay for sure.
And I think on that, there is at the same time going to be a tension between, when you look at the unemployment statistics and the number of people who have just completely lost their incomes, there's going to be a tension between this priority priority on putting good things in your body and affordability, and what are people spending money on. And there has been movement towards putting higher quality, nutritious food, and adopting diets that are higher quality, and higher quality meats, higher quality proteins. Is that going to be something that people can afford to do, and how are they going to balance that? When you look at the number of people on nutrition assistance growing dramatically, when you look at I think they said 1 in 5 kids now is food insecure.
Yeah. I have been wondering that with, some of the alternatives or some of the nice to haves. And at the same time, while you've been seeing spikes in sales of some of the plant-based, meat consumption or purchases from in the homes is also has increased, of course, because it's gone from food service to the home. So, and that kind of reverting back to what I wonder how much people want to be experimental at this time as well.
I think on that, just on that, just quickly, because it's an interesting, idea and point that you're bringing up there. I think that the surge in Beyond Meat demand and other companies like that. I think part of that was, hey, we were eating this before, we just want more of it stocked up in our sort of freezer, as a safety net. I think there was some of that for sure, just like any other product. But I do think part of that number, and I was on I was corresponding back and forth with Ethan Brown at Beyond Meat last week, just catching up, and I had led the S2G investment into that. It was actually the first investment for S2G, and it was my first investment as a lead in the fund. And we were kind of reminiscing back into the early days of Beyond Meat. So, I started tracking that company in 2013, actually through Food Tech Connect was the place in 2013 that I first found out about Beyond Meat on one of the blogs. But when I met Ethan in 2014, he was talking about this vision for, a meatless, world. He wasn't, it wasn't a militant, sort of view. Beyond Meat always had a flexitarian, approach to, the sector, but it was one of these, what ifs, could we imagine? And I think what COVID, brought out was a understanding of not only the stakeholders of the food system, but also in consumers, of asking more and more, where does our food come from? And understanding the potential impacts around and the implications of their food choices on not only the food system and their own personal health, but things like COVID. And so I think that could be a lasting, stickiness on the other side of this for those kind of companies, in which, there is this recognition that we need to understand more about where our food comes from, how it's made, what implications does it represent. And I think that's exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And around some of that traceability, technologies on that front as well, and things in the supply chain. Some consumers that never really have faced anything like food insecurity or food shortage, whether it's myself not being able to get yogurt, it's something that's kind of new, right? And people start to think more about how that food is getting to that supermarket. So I think you're right on that. That is exciting.
Yeah. And the Chinese have sort of been dealing with this for a lot longer than we have. So, obviously they had a pork production system that was completely decimated, by, one of these, sort of viral, strains. And, that
African
had
swine flu.
that had major impacts on how they saw the food system, how they dealt with food security, resiliency, global markets, all of that, and gave some momentum to companies like Omnipork, and companies like Beyond Meat now just launched, and Starbucks in China. I think they've had more history of the implications of food system tragedies to how their societies function. We're in the early innings of that understanding. We're way behind, but I think we're going to be catching up now as a result of this.
So I would add that also there's potential for other technologies that are working in and around livestock farming to make them more, well, not just more efficient, but to make them safer, and to keep those animals in a better place. And you guys are in fact, protein source agnostic, which I guess gets us to the crux of our conversation today, which is your new focus area for FoodShot, which is around precision protein. So Sarah, can you just give a bit more in-depth explanation of what FoodShot is from what I introduced with, and then talk about how your different focus areas work?
Absolutely. So yeah, we're, like you said, a collaborative, integrated investment platform. We have about 20, just over 20 partners from around the world. They include universities like UC Davis and Wageningen University, Rabobank, Mars, Rockefeller Foundation, the Builders Initiative, the Foundation for Food and Ag Research, venture funds and family offices, Armonia, Acre, Yamaha Motor Ventures, Grantham Family Foundation. And so we have this really diverse range of partners, and that allows us to have a capital continuum of both prize or grant money through, which is up over $500,000 for researchers, early stage entrepreneurs, and policy work, and then also equity investment of up to $10 million for for-profit businesses. So we're able to support innovation throughout the capital life cycle, from very early in the lab through the needs of a business, early stage investment, later stage investment, even growth stage investment. And we are really laser focused on the biggest systemic challenges to the healthy, equitable, sustainable food system that we seek. And so each year we focus on what we call FoodShot, so a moonshot for better food. And we put out a framework kind of outlining our vision for that, the future that we seek in that area. And so our first FoodShot was focused on innovating soil 3.0. So the idea was a new soil operating system and really making soil a medium for increased nutrient bioavailability, increased farmer profitability, and ecosystem restoration. And now we had a really exciting cycle. We had hundreds of applications. We awarded the prize to a couple scientists, one from Colorado State University, one from Wageningen, and a third seed prize to Doran Cox, who's doing the Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management, Open Team. And then we had an investment of $3 million in Trace Genomics, which is doing kind of genetic fingerprinting of the soil microbiome. And we're continuing, we're doing a deep dive with Soil 3.0 in 3 specific areas: the carbon measurement, soil carbon measurement, microbiome functionality, and rapid adoption of regenerative soil practices. And then we also launched just 2 weeks ago our precision protein food shot, which is a new framework for a protein system that better aligns regional supply and demand, prioritizes nutrition, really kind of the way Victor was talking about, as nutrition being more important than yield, and has a more rigorous understanding too of what protein is, that it's not just a single thing. It's composed of these 20 amino acids, and you have to have the balance of those amino acids to get the functional benefits of protein. And then also looking to reduce the kind of negative externalities of our current production protein system, whether it be zoonotic diseases or bacterial threats, or water contamination or land use challenges. So it's we're very excited about that new one.
Yeah. And what have been some of your biggest learnings around protein as you researched this topic? You know, obviously protein is in high demand, whether it's in emerging markets, shifting from more grains and rice into more of a meat diet, that increased demand, or it's over in the Western world and people associate protein with paleo diets and being healthy and getting fit and muscly. But what have been some of the learns you've had? Because protein is obviously much more important than just some of those things.
I think the way I would answer that is, and it was similar in the time we started taking and putting together our soil framework, which is just how little we actually know. I think that was the fundamental understanding that we came to quickly with soil, was that soil science was really just in the early stages of being fully understood. And so, you know, how are you going to, you know, create global, you know, approaches to, you know, soil health and regeneration and things like that if you didn't, you know, really understand how soil ultimately worked. I think that's the same with protein. And I think the reason why we named it precision, you know, protein, is just how imprecise the system is. And so we tend to think pretty simplistically around protein, plant versus animal, regional versus global, good versus evil. It's pretty much associated, I think, you know, almost the equation is, you know, health equals protein, you know, and protein equals meat and dairy. And so if you have more protein, you have, you know, more health. And I think that is the underlying understanding of people in the market, and certainly the way that the system has been, you know, organized till date. And that equation just is wrong, right? You know, it's much more complex, you know, than that. And it's almost like we've created a kind of a blunt instrument on protein that's in need of a much more surgical approach to how we produce, how we process, you know, how we consume. And so I found, you know, in thinking about this, just how many questions came up, you know, relatively quickly. And the thinking was like, how much protein actually do we need? You know, who needs it and where? Where are we over consuming and where are we under consuming protein? What amino acid profiles are most in need for like a human population? How much do I need, you know, individually? What protein sources, agriculture, meat, seafood, myco, algae, insects are best suited for, you know, what regions, you know, what economic and environmental pressures are there in those regions? What cultural traditions are in those regions? How much protein are we wasting? Can we waste less? Are we deteriorating the potency of proteins through how we produce and how we process it? Could we be less invasive? And are there other, molecules or, peptides and enzymes that can make proteins that we do produce more bioavailable, therefore more, efficient? So I started asking myself those questions and, came to the conclusion that we're not really approaching this very precisely. And that, if we're having stresses at 7 billion people, what are those stresses going to look like at 10 billion? So we better start looking at this more holistically. And recently, I've been starting to think of it almost as like, kind of like a body for protein. So nutrition that we talked about before is the spine, right? So the future protein system, nutrition needs to be the spine. Sustainability and resiliency kind of needs to be the brain. And accessibility and democratization sort of needs to be the heart. And we need to bring new science, new technologies, new methods of production, new methods of processing, and really think about our individual profiles as it relates to protein, because we're not all the same, right? Like, we're all in different life stages, in our journey in life, infant, child, teenager, adult, elderly. Those all have different nutritional needs. Protein is a macronutrient that has different implications for those life stages, different needs, male, female, different needs in regards to your health condition, and the Bright Seed data on 80% being actually clinically unhealthy, but a wide range of different chronic diseases and needs for potentially nutrition and food to play a role. All of that's got to be put together into a new way of thinking about how we organize a protein system, so that we can bring all of these great outcomes, stay within planetary, boundaries, and make sure that everybody, has access to an important macronutrient like protein, in the future, going forward.
So there's a lot of questions there, and that's what you're looking for. You're looking for innovators and scientists to answer some of those questions and bring some of those solutions to you. And you went through some of the key buckets, but you have a few key areas that you're looking for people to apply or be nominated for. And one of them is around the science. So as you mentioned, there's still a lot that's not known. So you want people to come forward with new thinking on the science. And then you're looking for companies or projects that are looking at novel ways of production to be more efficient environmentally and otherwise. And then there's the processing piece, and then there's the personalization piece, which I find really interesting and very exciting, but also, wow, what a big task, very complicated. But that concept that you were just talking about, where different people are going to have different protein needs. So can you give us sort of some examples of the types of companies that might be out there already, or scientific projects that you know of out there that would fit the bill to be relevant for this FoodShot precision protein?
I mean, Sarah and I probably have our own little, sort of favorite poster children as we sort of think about this. But, I'll name a couple, and then Sarah, feel free to dive in as well. You mentioned Bright Seed. I think they're a great, example of how, plant-based, ingredients can be used for scientifically proven ways of improving health and wellness. I think that's important because I think most people don't realize, or they don't think about, protein coming from agriculture, right? I think everybody sort of, puts this divide line, between where our protein source is coming from. Mostly proteins coming from the animal kingdom, and plants are bringing pretty much everything else. Well, that's not the case. Protein, in different amino acid forms with very different amino acid profiles that have specific mapping to our health systems come from agricultural sources, as well. And so it's going to be more and more important, as we start thinking about precision protein, what's the role for agriculture to play? And a company like Brightseed is going to play a role, in that. Grow Intelligence, which a company you're probably, quite familiar with, and the work Sara Menker is doing, that's using data to better map demand supply systems, globally, region by region, continent by continent, about where is the protein, what are its costs, what's its nutrient density, and really coming up with an amazing global map and set of economic, dynamics that can help shape where we put the resources into our protein supply chain. I think that's a really interesting company. A company called Digestiva, which is a new company that has an enzymatic approach that would allow proteins that you're consuming to have better bioavailability. I think a company like that's really interesting. A company like Caverdi, and I guess they've been named and reformed as Air Protein, that's, using these hydrogenotropes, these microbes that they've bred, that can, take CO2 and, create, new protein isolates, from that, completely decoupled from, agricultural systems and meat production systems, but, with a lot of promise on, being able to create protein with very little inputs on the resource side. So there are a couple of examples of things we feel fit within the precision protein umbrella. Sara, did you want to mention a couple?
I'll just mention one that just raised a Series A, Lemna, the dry grow, I guess, that just
yes, we wrote about them yesterday.
Just wrote about it. So new kind of source for animal feed that could reduce the pressure on soy-based animal feed. There are and then another one that I wanted.
So that would be making livestock farming essentially more efficient and sustainable. Yeah.
Some of the kind of algae-based feed additives that can significantly reduce methane
emissions
from cattle. Some of the kind of tools to support rotational grazing of livestock, so that you can better integrate them and reduce and actually use them as a tool to improve soil carbon sequestration. And then I think there's some really cool companies that are using, like insect or winesect. I don't know how they prefer.
Insect.
But that are looking at kind of the circular economy, where you are using food waste to feed insects, and then you're using the insects to feed the livestock, and it creates reducing waste and kind of upcycling a variety of ingredients.
Yeah.
So
and I'll just mention a couple more, because I just thought of them as Sara was mentioning that, and a really great example, not of just precision protein as an example, but as a process. So a company you're all, quite familiar with, an S2G portfolio company called Myco Technology, that's using shiitake mushrooms through a fermentation process to create a very umami-like protein isolate. Now, I think a lot of people probably listening to this podcast are familiar with that company, but what's fascinating about that, and what I think is the real precision protein piece of it, is how they came up with that. And so, when S2G and I actually personally invested in the company, they were a flavor modulation company, right? So they were creating these bitter blockers that would be used for coffee, or stevia was in the original focal point, to take those kind of after notes that people might find less optimal from a taste perspective, and extract those out of these commodities so that they could be more fully accepted by consumers. And so they were creating all of these bitter blockers through the use of this mushroom technology. And then they were seeing huge waste streams of mushrooms. And one day, just somebody asked the right question: is, I wonder what's in those mushrooms. Is there anything usable in there? Maybe there's protein. And so that idea is just fascinating to me, and really fits into our precision protein frame. Is, if we're in a resource constrained world and we're putting all of these resources into growing crops and growing, producing and farming protein, whether it's on the animal side or through other means like Myco technologies, there is a responsibility that we have as a society to understand that we have to find ways of making sure that every molecule, every benefit, is, extracted and farmed, because the cost of doing all of this, on environment, on human health, all of these things, have to be monetized at a certain point. So that Myco technology had that idea, what's in all of that waste? Is there something usable? Lended itself to a scientific analysis to find out whether that was the case, and an entirely new business case, which now they've been able to capitalize on. So I think that's a fascinating example.
Yeah. Another example of kind of the precision protein process is just like, there was a recent study that came out that showed that like millets and legumes combine to make a complete protein, right? And so it's not necessarily about having one source that gives you all of the nutrients you need, but what are the combinations and feed, for humans. It doesn't have to, again, it doesn't have to be an animal source protein. If you have the complementary plant or agriculture crops, you can get all of the amino acid, like the lysine, which can sometimes be a limiting factor. But if you have these complementary protein sources, you can meet that nutritional need. So the millet and legume combination does that. And millet is also a drought and heat resistant crop, so it ends up being quite powerful in terms of meeting nutritional needs.
Yeah, I mean, so that is a very, very diverse set of companies that you've spoken about and what you're looking for. And I think what I love about this challenge and your approach to it is that there's no silver bullet, there's no right or wrong. You're not, plants are good and meat is bad. And I think also it really speaks to how in our industry, we really need the brightest and best minds working on this, wherever they're coming from and whichever their angle they're taking. And you guys are really looking to, get everyone involved, which I think is awesome. So, you know, anyone listening that has any innovations or any ideas or wants to nominate someone that they know that's doing work in this field, please do reach out to FoodShot Global and apply. So thank you guys. I think we're definitely at time. That's been such an interesting conversation. Could keep talking to you guys all day. But I hope you're staying safe, and, you know, we'll speak soon, no doubt.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Louisa.
you so much, Louisa.
Thank you.
Stay safe, stay healthy.
Yeah, exactly.
Eat pine cones.
Eat pine cones,
Yeah.
That's awesome. What a great backdrop. What's your, and you've got FoodShot Global. That's awesome. Great.
Yeah.
All right.
Otherwise, it literally looks like I'm in my cupboard at home. Which I kind of am.
That's a good looking cupboard, though. I like your food choices. Though, what's with the pine cone? The pine cone, I'm not too sure of.
Yeah, how's that?
It's an interesting addition to the protein platter of protein. The pine
Is
cone.
it a new thing we're going to be eating? Pine cones? Maybe you'll discover it.
Precision protein pine cones.
Yeah, right.
Well, the pine cone is a perfect mathematical, it's the golden series, right? The Fibonacci series is represented in nature. So 2 + 3 = 5, 3 + 5 = 8, 5 + 8 = 13. Those proportions
I didn't know that was in the
are basically, the proportions of a pine cone. So it's esteemed in the world of mathematics.
Right. Still doesn't explain why it's on this image. So